Inside a cardboard box of broken stone debris, filed away in a South African research collection, a fragment was waiting to erase 30,000 years from the history of human art, and it almost got left there, mistaken for trash. For over a century, the world's museums, textbooks, and university departments have credited one place with inventing art: Ice Age Europe. That story is wrong. The real answer was sitting in a storage box on the other side of the world, and the archaeological establishment nearly missed it completely. Luca Polarolo wasn't looking for it. A researcher at a laboratory linked to the University of the Witwatersrand, he spent his days sorting through thousands of ordinary stone flakes, checking each one for nothing more exciting than edge damage and wear patterns. It was routine, forgettable work. Until one flake stopped him cold. Faint red lines, crossing each other in a deliberate pattern, ochre pressed into stone by a human hand, on purpose. That flake had come out of the ground at Blombos Cave, a narrow, wave-cut opening in a cliff on South Africa's southern coast, back in 2011. The pattern on it has since been dated to roughly 73,000 years old, older than Stonehenge, older than the famous painted caves of France by tens of thousands of years. And the closer scientists looked at it, the stranger the story got. For most of the last century, if you asked where human art began, the answer was simple: Europe. Ice Age caves like Lascaux in France and Chauvet, their walls covered in painted bison, horses, lions, thick black outlines rendered by torchlight 40,000 years ago. When Lascaux was rediscovered in 1940, people called it the Sistine Chapel of Prehistory. Governments protected it. Millions of visitors tried to see it, until the moisture from human breath started damaging the paint, and the caves had to be sealed and replaced with replicas. That is how much reverence the world built around the idea that art began there, in those dark limestone chambers in France and Spain. Textbooks called it the human revolution, a sudden explosion of imagination and symbolic thought that supposedly appeared in Europe out of nowhere, as if something switched on inside the human mind and the first thing it did was paint a cave wall. Africa, in that old version of history, was where humans came from biologically. Not where they became fully human in the way that mattered, not where the art started. That split sat quietly underneath 100 years of museum design, exhibit placement, and academic funding, treated less like an open question and more like settled fact. It's worth asking why that split held on so long. Ice Age Europe had been excavated for over a century by the time anyone seriously dug into southern Africa's Middle Stone Age sites. More digging meant more discoveries, and more discoveries meant a louder, earlier claim on the origin story. The theory wasn't necessarily built on bias. It was built on an incomplete map, filled in by whichever regions had the most shovels in the ground first. Blombos didn't need to prove Europe wrong. It just needed someone to look at the right layer of sand. That version of history has a cave working against it. Near the small town of Still Bay, its floor is covered in sealed layers of ancient sand that have been building up, undisturbed, for over 100,000 years. From the outside, it doesn't look like much. A dark mouth and a rock face, waves crashing somewhere below, salt air drifting into a space barely larger than a small apartment. No columns, no dramatic chambers, nothing like the cathedral-sized caverns tourists picture when they hear the word cave. But for more than 2 decades, this modest opening has been quietly producing evidence that the old timeline is wrong. And the deeper archaeologists dig into it, the harder the simple story becomes to defend. Here is the first crack. The stone flake with the 9 red lines wasn't found during some dramatic breakthrough moment, with cameras rolling and headlines ready. It came out of the ground sealed inside Middle Stone Age layers that had been forming for tens of thousands of years, and for a while nobody realized what they were holding. It got boxed, cataloged, and set aside with the rest of that season's debris, filed among broken flakes with no obvious markings at all. For years, a drawing older than agriculture, older than writing, older than the wheel sat quietly in storage, indistinguishable from the waste around it. That should bother you. If the oldest known drawing by human hands could sit unnoticed for years, what does that say about everything else we assume has already been found, cataloged, and understood? What else is sitting in a box somewhere right now, mislabeled as nothing? You already know how Palarolo found it, sorting flakes for wear patterns, not art. What you don't know is how the team reacted once he handed it over. 3 lines, roughly parallel, curving slightly. 6 more crossing them at angles. A deliberate crosshatch, the kind of mark a hand makes with intention, not the kind stone makes on its own. This wasn't a stray smear from a stained tool. It was a message, or the closest thing to one that had survived 73,000 years. The team didn't rush to call it art. That word carries too much weight, too many assumptions, too much room for other researchers to tear the claim apart in peer review. What they had, cautiously, was a symbol deliberately placed on a surface that had clearly been broken. The line stopped abruptly at the flake's edge, which meant the drawing hadn't started and ended on this small piece. It had continued onto a larger surface, a surface that is either destroyed, lost somewhere in the layers of the cave, or still buried, waiting for someone to find it. To understand why this discovery mattered so much, you have to go back to how this cave earned its reputation in the first place. And that story only makes the drawing stranger. Christopher Hinshelwood began excavating Blombos cave in 1991. At the time, nobody expected the site to challenge anything. He wasn't chasing a theory about the origins of art. He was mapping Middle Stone Age occupation along the southern Cape Coast, the kind of methodical, unglamorous fieldwork that rarely makes the news. It was a modest cave, roughly the size of a small apartment, sealed off from the outside world for tens of thousands of years by collapsing dune sand. But sealed sites are gold to archaeologists, because sealed layers don't lie. Nothing gets mixed in from later periods. Nothing drifts down from more recent centuries. Whatever is found inside a sealed layer belongs to that layer, and only that layer, frozen in place like a closed evidence room nobody had opened in tens of thousands of years. By 1999 and 2000, Hinshelwood's team had pulled 2 pieces of engraved red ochre out of those sealed deposits. Geometric patterns, cross-hatching, deliberately incised, not accidental, the strokes running with a rhythm that looked intentional under magnification. Published in the journal Science in 2002, dated to roughly 77,000 years old, they were among the earliest known examples of abstract symbolic markings made by modern humans anywhere on Earth. That alone should have been the headline for a generation. Instead, it triggered something closer to institutional discomfort. If early humans in Africa were making deliberate symbolic marks tens of thousands of years before the famous European cave art, then the entire architecture of the human revolution theory had a problem it couldn't easily explain away. Some researchers pushed back immediately, questioning whether the incisions were truly symbolic or simply the accidental result of using the ochre for something else, a debate that has never fully gone away. It's a familiar pattern in this field. A find gets published, the evidence looks solid, and then the wider community spends years quietly testing whether it survives contact with skepticism. Blombos kept surviving. That, more than any single artifact, is what eventually forced people to take the site seriously. The site kept talking anyway. In 2008, during another excavation season, the team recovered 2 abalone shells from the sealed layers. Inside them, traces of a mixed ochre compound, something closer to a prepared paint than raw pigment scraped straight from a rock. Alongside the shells, grindstones, hammerstones, bone, charcoal, the full toolkit required to crush, combine, and store a substance on purpose. Published in 2011, dated to around 100,000 years old, this wasn't just a symbol anymore. This was the oldest known evidence of humans deliberately manufacturing a compound and storing it in a container for later use. A paint kit sealed in the sand for 1,000 centuries, waiting for someone to open it and ask what it had been made for. Notice the pattern forming here. Engraved ochre with cross-hatching around 77,000 years ago. a prepared ochre compound with storage containers around 100,000 years ago. And now, a crosshatched drawing on a stone flake at roughly 73,000 years old, made with a pointed ochre implement. The same motif appearing again, decades apart, in different excavation seasons, described by different researchers who weren't looking for a pattern when they found it. Is that a coincidence, or does it mean something was being communicated, intentionally, consistently enough across tens of thousands of years to count as culture passed down the way a technique or a story gets passed down generation to generation? Nobody can answer that with certainty. But the coincidence, if that's what it is, keeps refusing to go away. And there's a second layer of suspicion sitting underneath all of this. For years, researchers had also been finding lumps of ground ochre at Blombos, with faceted, pointed ends worn down the way a pencil wears down with use. Some archaeologists assumed these were simply waste, byproducts of grinding pigment for some other unknown purpose, not tools used for deliberate mark-making at all. The debate over what these objects actually were sat unresolved for years, treated as a minor technical disagreement, easy to ignore if you weren't paying close attention to the footnotes. It wasn't minor. It just took the right test to prove it, and that test was still years away. Even Christopher Hinshelwood, the man who led the excavation and co-authored the discovery, is careful with his words when he talks about the flake. He avoids calling it art outright. In his own language, it's a symbol. That hesitation might sound like scientific caution. It's also a warning. If the researcher who found the oldest known drawing on Earth won't commit to calling it art, that tells you how unstable the ground under this discovery really is, and how much rides on getting the next round of testing right. So the team did what scientists do when a claim this large needs to survive scrutiny from the rest of the field: test it, piece by piece, method by method, until the doubt had nowhere left to hide. The first question was simple and brutal. Are these lines actually pigment, deliberately applied to the stone, or are they mineral veins, natural streaks running through the rock that just happen to look like something? Under a microscope, that question gets answered fast, but the team didn't stop at a quick look. Working with Francesco De Rico's laboratory at the University of Bordeaux, they ran the flake through microscopy, Raman spectroscopy, and scanning electron microscopy, 3 separate methods designed to catch exactly the kind of natural coincidence that could destroy a claim like this in front of the whole scientific community. Each one confirmed the same thing. The red material sat on top of the stone's surface, layered over it, not embedded inside it. It hadn't grown there through some slow mineral process. It had been placed there by hand. That ruled out geology. It didn't rule out accident. A flake could theoretically pick up a smear of ochre from contact with something else, a stained tool, a stained hand, without anyone intending to draw anything at all. So the researchers went further, into the kind of test that turns a lab into a small, focused crime scene, matching evidence to method the way an investigator matches a weapon to a wound. They took modern ochre, shaped it into a pointed crayon the way ancient toolmakers likely shaped their own pigment, and tried to physically reproduce the lines on similar stone under controlled conditions, testing different pressures, different angles, different states of dryness. In the pigment itself, the experimental marks matched, down to the width, 1.3 to 3.3 millimeters, the exact range found on the original flake. That kind of consistent width isn't produced by a smear or a passing stain. It's produced by a hand, applying a shaped point of pigment, dragging it across a surface with pressure and control. Somebody drew this, deliberately, 73,000 years ago, on a coastline that hasn't stopped changing since. But proving what the marks were was only half the problem. The team still had to prove when, and that meant confronting the layer of sand the flake had been buried in, using a method that sounds almost impossible until you understand how it actually works. Optically stimulated luminescence dating doesn't look at the object itself. It looks at the sand around it. Buried quartz grains slowly absorb background radiation from the surrounding Earth over time, trapping tiny amounts of energy inside their crystal structure like a battery quietly charging in total darkness. Sunlight resets that charge back to zero. So the moment a grain of sand gets buried, shielded from light by the layers piling up above it, the clock starts running again from nothing. Dig it up in a lab decades or millennia later, expose it briefly to a controlled light source, measure how much trapped energy releases in that instant, and you get a number. How long has it been since this particular grain last saw daylight? That number is the age of the layer, and by extension, the age of everything sealed inside it. Researchers at the University of Wollongong, working with single grains of quartz, rather than bulk samples scraped from a whole layer, ran that test across the full Blombos sequence, grain by grain, discarding any that showed signs of contamination or disturbance from burrowing animals or later digging. It's slow, exacting work, the kind that happens under laboratory screens with almost no room for shortcuts. The layer that produced the drawing came back at approximately 73,000 years old, and the dates lined up in the correct order all the way down the sequence, older at the bottom, younger toward the top, exactly what you'd expect from a site that had never been disturbed. Nothing about this process looks dramatic from the outside. A technician in a darkened room handling sand under a dim red safe light to make sure no stray daylight resets the very clock they're trying to read, feeding grain after grain into a machine that measures light so faint the human eye could never register it. But the results carry more weight than almost anything else in this story because a drawing without a secure date is just an interesting piece of rock. Independent methods, including thermoluminescence dating on burnt stone tools and uranium series dating on mineral crusts, produced overlapping results that backed up the luminescence dates instead of contradicting them. Above the drawing's layer sits a stretch of sterile wind-blown dune sand with nothing cultural in it at all, a natural seal that locked the older material in place for tens of thousands of years before anyone touched it again. The dating held. The pigment analysis held. The experimental match held. By every standard the researchers could apply, publish, and defend, this was a genuine, intentional, securely dated drawing made by a human hand nearly 75,000 years before the cave paintings of Lascaux were ever touched by torchlight. That should have ended the debate. It didn't. It just moved the argument somewhere bigger, somewhere with higher stakes and a lot more continents involved. Because the moment Blombos claimed the title of the oldest known drawing, it forced a comparison against other claims scattered across the planet, claims that complicate the story instead of simplifying it. In Spain, a very different kind of evidence had already been sitting inside three cave sites: La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Ardales. Instead of dating the paint directly, researchers used uranium-thorium dating on thin mineral crust that had formed naturally over the painted surfaces. The same slow dripping process that builds stalactites in a cave over thousands of years. If a crust sitting on top of a painting is a certain age, the painting sealed underneath it has to be at least that old, maybe far older. The results, published in the journal Science in 2018, gave minimum ages of nearly 65,000 years for a red ladder-shaped symbol at La Pasiega, over 66,000 years for a hand stencil pressed onto rock at Maltravieso, and over 65,000 years for painted mineral formations at Ardales. Those numbers are older than modern humans are known to have reached Europe, which left the researchers with an uncomfortable conclusion. If the dates were correct, the paintings weren't made by us. They were made by Neanderthals. Sit with that for a moment. For over a century, Neanderthals were treated as the slower, less capable cousins of modern humans, incapable of symbolic thought, incapable of anything resembling art, portrayed in museum dioramas as hunched, grunting, and dim. If they were putting painted marks on cave walls in Spain before modern humans even arrived on the continent, an entire chapter of how we define human uniqueness collapses. Not because of a theory or a hunch, because of mineral crusts and isotope ratios sitting in a laboratory tray. Think about what that would mean for a title like Oldest Drawing by Human Hands. If the Spanish dates hold, humans wouldn't even be the only species in that sentence. The word human itself would need to expand to include a species we spent a century dismissing as primitive. That's not a footnote. That's the kind of reversal that forces museums to rewrite wall text they've had bolted up for decades. Except the debate didn't stop there either. Other researchers pushed back hard, publicly and in print. A rebuttal published in the Journal of Human Evolution in 2019 argued that uranium-thorium dating on open, porous cave surfaces can be thrown off by uranium leaching in and out of the mineral crust over time, potentially inflating the age far beyond what's actually real. If that critique holds up, the Spanish paintings could be significantly younger, made by modern humans after all, and the entire Neanderthal artist's claim collapses back into uncertainty, exactly where it started. Nobody has settled this. Both sides have published and argued, and neither has walked away. And Spain wasn't the only complication. On the other side of the world, in Sulawesi, Indonesia, archaeologists have been uncovering something completely different. Not abstract lines scratched onto a portable stone. Actual scenes, painted onto limestone cave walls, figures of animals, hunting compositions, narrative images that seem to tell a story rather than simply mark a surface. Picture the warty pig itself, a heavy-bodied animal rendered in ochre red across limestone, tusks visible, its outline confident enough that modern viewers immediately recognize the species. Dating using uranium series methods placed that painting at a minimum age of 45,000 years, and a more recent narrative scene showing what looks like a hunting story involving human and animal figures together pushed back even further with a published minimum age of over 51,000 years. Unlike the abstract crosshatch at Blombos, these are recognizable pictures, images that seem to depict a specific event rather than a repeated symbolic pattern, which is exactly why some researchers argue Sulawesi, not Blombos, and not Spain, deserves the title of the first true storytelling. So now there are 3 separate claims, from 3 separate continents, each one holding a different title, and none of them agreeing to share it. Blombos has the oldest known drawing, a deliberate abstract mark on a small, portable object you can hold in your hand. Spain may have older painted marks on a cave wall if the dating survives its critics, but the artist behind them might not even be human. Sulawesi has the oldest known figurative scene on record, actual pictures telling something that resembles a story. There is no single clean answer to who made the first piece of art on Earth. There are 3 unresolved answers, arguing with each other across 3 continents, each backed by real scientists and real data, and every year of new research has a chance of rearranging them again. Picture a warty pig frozen mid-stride on a limestone wall in Sulawesi, a red ladder shape sealed under centuries of mineral crust in Spain, and 9 crossed lines on a broken stone in South Africa. 3 images, 3 continents, 3 separate teams of researchers, who would each, understandably, like their site to hold the record. That instability didn't stop critics from pushing on Blombos itself. Curtis Marian, an archaeologist who has spent years studying human origins in southern Africa, has raised the same caution that applied to the earlier ochre debate. Some marked or pointed ochre pieces found at sites like this could be the accidental byproduct of grinding pigment for entirely practical use, not evidence of deliberate symbolic behavior at all. Researcher Lynn Wadley asked the same uncomfortable question years earlier in her own published work, with a title that gets straight to the point: ochre crayons or waste products. Neither researcher is dismissing Blombos outright. They're doing what good science requires, holding the most exciting possible interpretation up against the most boring possible explanation, and refusing to let go of either until the evidence forces a decision. So far, it hasn't. The pointed, faceted ochre pieces could be drawing tools. They could also be the leftover shape of grinding pigment for a completely different, unglamorous purpose, like coloring skin, hide, or cordage. Both explanations fit the wear patterns. Only one of them makes headlines. And Margaret Conkey, an archaeologist who has spent her career studying the origins of image making, warned against something else entirely. Not whether the Blombos evidence is real, but how easily the story gets rewritten into a new, equally simplistic myth. Replace the old idea that art began in Europe with the new idea that art began in Africa, she argued, and you've made the same mistake twice. Just move the finish line to a different continent instead of admitting the truth might be messier than any single origin story allows. Symbolic behavior may not have one origin point at all. It may have emerged in scattered pockets, at different times, in different places, for reasons we still don't fully understand and may never fully recover from the archaeological record. That theory is uncomfortable precisely because it refuses to give the viewer a clean answer. No single hero site. No single triumphant discovery that settles the question forever and lets everyone move on. Just fragments scattered across continents, each one complicating the last, none of them finished talking. There's an uncomfortable incentive sitting underneath all of this too, one worth naming out loud. Every institution attached to a candidate site has something to gain from being right. A university gets prestige. A museum gets a headline exhibit. A country gets to claim the origin point of human creativity within its own borders. None of that makes the science dishonest. Peer review exists precisely to catch bias before it hardens into fact. But it does mean every claim to the title, oldest, arrives with a quiet undertow of motivation, and the strongest evidence is the evidence that survives scrutiny from people who would benefit from tearing it down. Then, in 2025, Blombos produced one more twist nobody was expecting for material that had already been sitting in storage. A study published in the journal Science Advances, led by researcher Elizabeth Velicky, working with Henshillwood's team, examined a set of ochre pieces from the site and found something the earlier symbolic framing had missed entirely. Several of these pieces weren't crayons or drawing tools at all, they were retouchers, specialized implements used to shape and sharpen the edges of stone tools through a technique called pressure flaking, dated to layers stretching from roughly 90,000 to 70,000 years old. Ochre, the same material used to make the world's oldest known drawing, was also being used as industrial equipment, tool-making hardware, not art supplies, which means the old argument, symbol versus tool, drawing material versus manufacturing byproduct, was never really a choice between two separate categories in the first place. Early humans at Blombos were using the same substance for both, sometimes within the same excavated layer, sometimes possibly in the same hands. That reversal changes how you have to read everything before it. The debate wasn't ever going to be solved by picking a side. Ochre wasn't a symbolic material that occasionally got used as a tool, or a tool that occasionally became symbolic by accident. It was both, deliberately, simultaneously, in ways the archaeological record is only now catching up to, a century after the first digs began. So where does that leave the flake behind the glass? Blombos Cave is not a closed case. It's an active excavation, still running seasons under the Sapien CE Research Center at the University of Bergen, an ongoing partnership with the University of the Witwatersrand. New papers are still being published. New interpretations are still overturning old assumptions, sometimes within a matter of months, sometimes decades after the original artifact came out of the ground. The 2025 ochre retoucher discovery is proof that even settled-sounding conclusions from a site this well-studied can be rewritten by a fresh look at material that had already been sitting in storage for years, cataloged, filed, and mostly forgotten. And that raises a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. If a piece of ochre could sit in a research collection for over a decade before anyone recognized it as evidence of tool making, and a drawing could sit unnoticed even longer before anyone recognized it as the oldest known image made by human hands, what else is still sitting in those boxes right now? What has already been excavated, cleaned, cataloged, and shelved, waiting for someone to look at it the right way, on the right afternoon, under the right light? That's not a rhetorical flourish. It's how this discovery actually happened. Nobody set out looking for the oldest drawing in the world. Someone was doing routine debris analysis and refused to look away from something that didn't fit. The next reversal in this story, whenever it comes, probably won't come from a fresh excavation either. it will come from someone reopening an old box. There's a wider stake buried underneath all of this too, one that has nothing to do with chemistry or dating methods. For most of the 20th century, the accepted story of human origins gave Africa credit for biology and gave Europe credit for culture. One continent produced the species. The other, according to the old framing, produced the mind. Blombos, along with the growing body of evidence around it, argues that this split was never accurate to begin with. The capacity for symbolic thought, for planning, for storing meaning outside the human brain in a physical object appears to have existed in Africa tens of thousands of years before modern humans ever set foot in the caves of France and Spain. That's not a small correction to a textbook footnote. That's a redistribution of credit for one of the most defining traits of our species, moved from one continent to another decades after the museums had already built their exhibits around the old version and printed the old captions. The artifacts themselves have started to move too. The stone flake, the engraved ochre pieces, and related material from Blombos have been displayed at the Isiko South African Museum in Cape Town, and more recently, at the Origin Center at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, part of a deliberate effort to place these objects in front of the public in the country where they were actually found, on the coastline where they were actually made, not shipped abroad to sit in a European institution telling the old version of the story. In South Africa, telling its own, under its own lights, for its own visitors. That choice carries weight beyond curation. For decades, some of the most significant fossils and artifacts pulled out of African soil ended up in European collections, studied and displayed thousands of miles from where they were found. Their origin countries left with replicas or nothing at all. Keeping the Blombos material close to home in institutions run by South African researchers and South African universities is a quiet rebuttal to that pattern, as much a statement about who gets to narrate this discovery as it is about where the object physically sits. But the flake itself still carries an unfinished quality that no amount of museum lighting can fix. The lines stop abruptly at a broken edge. Whatever the original drawing looked like in full, it existed on a larger surface that has never been recovered. Maybe it was destroyed thousands of years ago, ground down by the same forces that carved the cave itself out of the cliff. Or maybe it's still down there, sealed under sand that hasn't been touched since before the last ice age, waiting inside a cave that has already rewritten the story of human creativity twice, and clearly isn't finished doing it. Stand in front of that display case in Johannesburg, and you're not just looking at a rock behind glass. You're looking at the earliest known proof that a human being once picked up a piece of colored earth, shaped it to a point, pressed it against stone, and made a mark on purpose, 73,000 years before anyone would think to write that intention down. 9 lines crossing each other, cut off mid-thought at a broken edge that has never been explained and may never be. Nobody knows what it meant to the person who made it. Nobody knows if the rest of it will ever surface in this excavation season, or the next, or 100 years from now, in a box someone finally decides to open properly. And somewhere back inside that cave, on the southern coast of South Africa, past the wave-cut opening and the sealed dune layers, past the sand that has already given up a paint kit, an engraved code, and the oldest drawing on Earth, more of it is still sitting there, undisturbed, waiting, still holding whatever comes next.